Go. Okay, guys, it's that time of the semester. Um, like I just said, this has been the most brutal hiring season in years. A lot more people just don't seem to have any offers compared to previous years. When I was a sophomore or junior, I would talk to people and it would seem like everyone had something lined up. And unfortunately, that just doesn't seem to be the case now. Because we're getting closer and closer to the summer, I wanted to share some tips for how you can really optimize your time to improve the recruiting process for yourself. And while I'm not in that position right now, I was in this position 2 years ago as a sophomore where I was searching for an internship all year and I just couldn't get anything until literally I applied for a place during spring break, which is next week for us now. And I got the offer a few days before finals. So first thing I just want to say is if you want to learn anything from my story, do not give up. It's not over until you have reached summer. So if you've stopped applying, start again. Because miracles can happen, and there's still 2 more months. Now, one is this gonna go? We're gonna talk about a few ways that you can try to catch up if you've fallen behind in the application process. So first thing are gonna be the job apps themselves. Second thing is if you're behind on projects. Third, if you're behind on interview prep. And then fourth, just how to prioritize your time dealing with all these things. So let's start by talking about applications. Now, the single most important thing for you to know is that you need to apply relentlessly. This is how you need to look when you're applying. And I'm serious because a lot of people have trouble getting offers, but a lot of them aren't really applying to places, right? And that's a problem because some people who really do apply aggressively still don't get any luck. And if you think 500 is bad, for some people, that's nothing. Try 700 and say that's not enough. And then try 1,151 to get an offer. Now, obviously, that's not going to be everyone's experience. I really hope it's not going to be any of your guys' experience. But the point I'm trying to drive home is that you need to apply frequently and massively. In this market right now, quantity beats quality. This late in the cycle, you cannot afford to be picky because there just aren't that many more options to pick from. So if you had dreams of being a FANG engineer this summer, I'm sorry to shatter them, but that ship has pretty much sailed for now. Big tech hiring is mostly done in the fall, as I'm sure a lot of y'all know. There's a little bit in like the winter and like early spring, but by now it's pretty much done. So what you really want to do is target small to medium companies. Now, just to show an example here, every single one of us being in this club has heard of Discord before. This is a posting for one of their intern positions. It got 10,000 applicants, over 10,000. Now, in contrast, we've got a company here called Teledyne Technologies Incorporated. I've never heard of them in my life, but what I do know is that this posting for them had 54 applicants, which, 10,000 versus 54, I would take my odds with the bottom way more, right? Now, another thing that you want to be wary of is how recent a job was posted. If you notice with that smaller company right there, that screenshot was taken 6 hours after the posting was made. What happens a lot of times is that on these job boards, they will leave a posting up long after they've started accepting applicants. So if you see a post that's been up for 3, 4 weeks, a month, odds are they've already started putting people through the interview process and you're just wasting your time by applying for it. So what you need to do is whatever job board you're on, sort by the recent postings. So on LinkedIn, for example, here, if you come to the left here, click date posted, hit the past 24 hours, you'll be able to filter it down to postings that just came out in the past day. And if we look right here, you can see we've got an internship position for Crown Castle. Screenshot was taken 1 hour after the posting went live, and there were only 16 applicants. And hint, hint, I made this entire workshop last night. So this screenshot was taken less than 24 hours ago for those of y'all who want to apply at places. But the idea is that you really do not want to go for positions that have already had a backlog of tens of thousands of people, right? Now, another potential tactic is cold calling and DMs. We're encouraging y'all to go for smaller companies at this point, and this tactic works well with smaller companies. Why is that? Well, for one, there's less bureaucracy, right? If you're applying to a big tech company, you will have HR and hiring managers, and you actually have to talk to members of the team. You might interview with like 10 different people who are on different teams, and they just have a really rigid, standardized hiring process. When there's less layers of bureaucracy, there's not as many approvals that have to be done to get you into a position. And that makes it a lot easier if you can impress the right person. There's also less competition because naturally less people know about these companies. And this is a really specific scenario. If you talk to a smaller company and they weren't necessarily planning on doing an internship position, but you contact someone in their management and say, hey, I've got so and so experience. I'm willing to work over the summer. I'd love to help you guys out. This could get you an internship. This is actually how Michael, our VP, got his first internship. And this tactic works especially well with local companies because unless you're from somewhere like Seattle, where Microsoft is a local company for you, they're oftentimes a lot smaller and you can make more connections with those people easier. Now, a lot of you guys might have some problems with that approach, right? At this point, you might think it takes too long. If I've got to apply to a bunch of places, there's so much individual effort to go into each company. You're tired. You want to break at this point. You're already burnt out from school and you're not good at cold calls, right? You might have never done it before. I'm not going to say that these are reasons why you shouldn't use the previous tactic, but if you really don't want to do that, here's a strategy that's worked for me. Apply to jobs while you're watching TV. And a couple of y'all laugh, but I am so serious. This was how I got my first internship because all of these applications are the same. Like, how many of y'all have filled the same Workday application out like 10,000 times, right? It's so irritating, but it's really once you do it enough times, it becomes mindless. Just watch out for the um commonplace. I wouldn't say commonplace. Every so often, you'll get a question that's a bit different. So just make sure you're actually reading what the forms say. But I think most of you guys know what your name, address, graduation date is, right? So literally, if you need time to take a break, spring break is next week. Just sit down, watch YouTube, TV, Netflix, listen to a podcast, whatever you do, and just spam applications, right? And that's really key to getting a lot in because online applications are a numbers game. If you only apply to 20 places, your odds are you're going to be unemployed this summer. You really need to spam them. Find as many companies as you can, keep spamming the applications until someone lets you in. That being said, there is one caveat with this, and you don't want to spam applications to the same company too many times. Reason why is that if you're sending out applications for a bunch of unrelated roles, you're going to come off as desperate. And even if some of y'all are desperate, you don't want to look desperate because that will make the recruiters think that you're not a good candidate. So if you're going to spam a bunch of applications, just be careful if you're going towards the same company. And this is something I've like actually seen recruiters say is like a red flag to them. So watch out. Now, to recap for this section, apply, apply, apply. Send out as many applications as you possibly can. Target small companies and recent postings. And if you're talking about really small companies, try cold calling or DMing someone who works there. Now, the next aspect, let's say you're behind on your projects, right? Very first, most important thing. Actually, before I get in there, do we have any questions on the previous section? Yeah. Cover letters. Yeah, waste of time. Yeah, at this point in the process, when it's quantity over quality and the time it takes you to write a decent cover letter, you can apply to 10 more places. So I always say don't write a cover letter unless there's a place you really want to get into. But at this point in the cycle, if you don't have an offer yet, you probably missed a chance for the place you really wanted to get into. It's also, my potential criticism of cold calling because that does require some effort, like a cover letter. But the difference is someone's more likely to see a message on LinkedIn or pick up a phone call. Cover letters through an online application might not even get read. So I would say cover letters pretty much always a waste of time, especially in this scenario. Yeah. Yeah, I'd probably say at this point you don't want to tweak it for each individual job posting. Although what you can do is if you have a lot of projects and like different kind of subfields, you can make two different resumes for that. So let's say you've got a few front end position, you've got a few front end projects, you can make a front end resume. Let's say you've also got a few game dev projects, you like making games in your spare time. You can make a separate game dev resume and basically use each resume for whichever role it's most applicable to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can swap the bullet points too. But at this point, though, changing it for every application is just not an efficient use of time. Yeah. So the next part is going to be about projects. Now, the first most important thing for this section is that you want to try to work in teams, right? When you work with other people, you're going to be able to get more work done in the same amount of time or less. And that's going to lead to a better result overall, whether that's allowing you to add more features to your project, polish whatever features you're already working on, have better code quality. The more manpower, the more work you can get done. And that is really huge because the whole idea is we don't have a lot of time. Another big benefit is that teamwork can fill in skill gaps, especially for underclassmen who might not be familiar with a lot of different stacks. This can be useful because the teammates can do what you don't know, right? And that's useful because it gives you more options for projects you can choose. Let's say you had an idea for some kind of music recommendation app, and you had a really cool front end that you wanted to build for it, and you're good at building UIs, but you don't know how to actually do the music recommendation. Well, you could work on the project with a friend who maybe is better at backend stuff and have another guy who's good at ML. They can take care of those bases and you can focus on the part that you're good at. And that can allow you to not just get more done, but gives you more freedom in app ideas. It also is a good learning opportunity because you can learn by your teammates' example. Um, if you work with an older teammate who's good at a skill that you want to learn, they can take the lead on a few parts of the project. Then you can implement more and more pieces of it, kind of copy what they do, copy their code style, and you'll learn a lot just from doing that. Now, some of you might be thinking, will recruiters see this and think that I'm freeloading if I'm always working with other people on projects? And the answer is absolutely not. Companies actually love to see you working with other people. And that's because professional software development is almost never a solo job. We've probably said this a million times in this club, right? Technical communication is also a skill in of itself. And showing that you know how to communicate your work, how to coordinate your work with other developers is very valuable. And if you can show that to recruiters, then they don't have to take that risk when they're hiring you initially. And it also just shows that you're someone that can be worked with, right? Shows that you've got basic social skills. That being said, you do have to be a little bit careful because if you put a project on your resume, you should be able to explain it, right? Because in interviews, you will be asked about them. If you don't have any internship experience, your projects are going to be what they ask you about the most. So make sure that you know the details. You don't need to know every detail, right? That's the whole point. We don't have time to get into the nitty gritty of everything, but you should have a high level understanding of how your system works, how the different parts interact, and you should be really proficient in the part that you worked on. And yeah, like, mm-hmm. Yeah. That great point from Blake. Specify the parts that you worked on in the group projects, and we'll actually come back to that in a second. But just in general, make sure you know what you're talking about. It's going to be a really bad look for you if you have something on your resume and you just can't tell anyone anything about it. Now, another thing that you might have to do if you don't have a lot of projects at this point is to put any ongoing projects on your resume. If you've never heard of WIP before, it stands for work in progress. And you do have to be careful about doing that, but you might have to do it. Let's look at a timeline to explain why. Today is March 5th, right? Imagine after this workshop, you go home and start a project immediately, and it takes you until the last reading day to finish it. Well, the last day of finals is May 3rd. So that's basically the start of summer, right? If you wait until you're done with the project to put it on your resume, all of this time that you have here, you won't be able to gain any benefits from it. And that little blue section right there, that's going to be all the time that you have to apply to places with your updated resume. So you really, if you don't have other projects to add, you don't have a choice but to put your ongoing projects on the resume. That being said, it can be a bit risky to add projects that you haven't finished. So what do you need to do to prevent any issues here? First, again, you need to know how your project works at the high level, right? Obviously, you're not going to know every little detail because you're still working on it, but you should know what the app's going to do, how it's going to work, what the architecture is going to be, those sorts of things. And you also need to have realistic goals, right? If you start a project today that you want to finish by the end of the semester, like you can't tell people that you're going to rewrite Unreal Engine. People think you're either a liar, insane, or both. So have realistic goals and make sure that you can actually finish your project. You don't want to make promises you can't keep because you could very well be held accountable to it. As a quick example here, in my sophomore year, I worked on a project called 3.2 Stacks. Some of the longtime SSD members might remember this. It was one of my first front end projects ever. Worked on it with our former president, Eric, and another SSD officer. And I really learned a lot about doing front end development that way. Now, when I was applying for what eventually became my internship, they asked me about this project in the final round. And I said, it's still a work in progress. You know, I was transparent with the recruiter. You can tell, I'm sorry, with the engineer, you can tell people that the projects are still going on. You don't want to lie to them. But I told them, hey, it's going to be done and ready in a few weeks, and you can find it at 32stacks.com. Now, what I didn't find out until in the middle of my internship was a few weeks later, my interviewer and the team's tech lead went onto the site and played the game against each other and tested it. And one of the main reasons why I got the hire was because I actually had a deployed project that worked as promised. So, what lessons can we learn here? Uh, Number one, I worked with others, green flag, right? And it also gave me an opportunity to learn from others because I learned a lot about front end when I didn't have experience with it. I even learned a library styled components that I ended up using every day at my internship that summer. We finished it on time, we kept our promises, and we also deployed it so that other people could see that we actually built this thing. So again, all of the kind of concepts that we've talked about for catching up with projects on a short time, they're coming into play here. And I want to touch more about on this. Try to release at least one of your projects publicly. So depending on the kind of app you're doing, if it's a front end or back end, you'll probably have a cloud deployment. If you're doing a desktop mobile app or a game, it'll probably be some like kind of exe that they can download. Idea is it needs to be compiled, built, and ready for a user to run. And there's a few options for this. If you're doing cloud, AWS is the most common option. There are a lot of competitors though. Companies like Vercel and Netlify are known for having much simpler user interfaces, so you don't have to learn all the bits and pieces of AWS, but they are a little bit more expensive though. And we do have a whole workshop on our YouTube about cloud if you're interested in that. And for downloadable apps, it's even easier because if you're doing a desktop app, you have to build it just to run it on your own computer. So it's just a matter of where can you host it. And luckily, on your GitHub page, you can have a link to a download. So this is an example for a recent C++ project right here, just in releases section. compiled one of my exes, put it in a zip folder, uploaded it, and anyone can go on there, download, and play my game. Now, this is really useful because you can easily distribute that app to anyone who's on a Windows machine, Linux, Android, iOS. Okay, probably not iOS. I don't know if anyone on mobile has tried like pushing things in the App Store. It kind of sucks. But at the very least, provide some kind of download link, even if it's not approved by Tim Apple. And then the last kind of tip for projects is learn how to hype up small projects and talk about them well, right? Obviously, with a limited time frame, you can't build the most impressive things, but you can talk about them like they're big. So first step is you need to know your audience. It's going to be a little bit different depending on if you're talking to a recruiter or an engineer. And you'll probably talk with both at some point during the interview process. So for recruiters, the first thing you have to know is that they're not as technically deep as an engineer. Now, that doesn't mean that they know nothing technically, right? If you tell a recruiter that you use React for your backend, you're probably not going to get a call back. But that being said, you want to try to use layman's terms when you're talking about your technical decisions, right? Don't talk about it like you're talking to another programmer. Say, I use X framework for so-and-so. We'll give basic justifications. But you have to remember for a lot of these people, these tools tend to be more check marks they need to tick off. Another really big tip is to talk about your features, motivation, and outcomes for your app. And those last two, motivations and outcomes, are really big because they can show some of your thought process without having to write a huge app. When I was taking professional communication for engineers, we did our research paper on Wi-Fi performance around the school. And to help measure the Wi-Fi around the school, I wrote a quick little command line app in C++, just called some command line utilities to get some network info, calculated some statistics we wanted, and then wrote them into a CSV. You know, stuff that you know how to do by the end of programming too. And it didn't take that long to write. But I was able to say, what's the word I'm looking for? Use numbers. I was able to quantify it. I said we were able to collect over 4,000 data points from 70 unique locations on a UF campus. And I was able to say, I wrote it because it saved us time. Because if you ever gone to one of those speed test websites, if you have to click through each button manually, it would take you forever to get the numbers you want. I wrote a solution that solved the problem because it allowed us to work a lot faster. So in that sense, talking about the product itself and the outcomes for it is a lot more useful when you're talking to recruiters, right? It's also just a good skill to have because eventually when you're talking to business stakeholders later in your career, they're not going to care about like what design pattern you used. Now with engineers, it's a bit more trickier because you can't BS them on any technical topics. So you're really going to want to try to make sure you know your stuff. So you need to show your understanding of the tools that you use for your project, right? This comes back to what Blake said earlier, where you want to try to keep the scope narrow and talk about the part of the project that you worked on, right? If you have a project you worked on with your teammates and you start talking about the backend, but you didn't write any backend code at all, that's going to come back to bite you, especially if the person who's engineering you is a backend engineer, or they might not even be a backend engineer. Sometimes professional devs work in other fields as hobbies for fun, and they might end up nerding out on you during the interview, and you might get caught with your pants down. And kind of just like with a technical interview, you want to talk through the technical decisions that you made for that project, tell them why you did it. You can be more in depth here than you would with a recruiter. And that's basically the difference between recruiters and engineers. So to kind of recap for projects, you want to work in teams, put your ongoing projects on your resume, and make sure you learn how to hype up your smaller projects and talk about them well. You got to learn to sell yourself. Now, before we go to the next category, do you have any questions on that regard? Okay, cool. So next we're going to talk about interview prep, mainly a technical interview prep. So if you've fallen behind on this, the first thing you need to do is address your weaknesses, right? Now, in general, anytime you're preparing for technical interviews, you should learn patterns, not problems, right? Memorizing individual problems, even when you've got a full hiring cycle ahead of you, isn't efficient. But you definitely can't afford to do that now when you don't have a lot of time. So what you should do is look at some topics. This is an example of a technical interview roadmap from NeetCode. He does LeetCode tutorials on YouTube if you've ever seen him. We've got a whole bunch of common question patterns here. So what you want to do is identify your weak points here, right? Find the earliest weak point on this kind of prerequisite chart, work at that a bit and work your way down. And then don't waste time practicing what you already know. If you're really good at tree problems, then don't do any tree problems. You don't have the luxury of time here. Now, another tip is that you need to be able to fail fast. What does that mean? Now, I'm sure a lot of us have worked on a really hard LeetCode problem before and then struggled with it for a couple of hours, had a bunch of failed attempts, and then we eventually got it and we were so proud of ourselves. While that can be a decent learning experience, you don't have the time to do this now. You need to set hard limits on how long you can struggle with a problem before you move on. Now, question is, when should you read that solution and move on? I would say if you have no idea where to start after 10 minutes, move on. And if you know where to start, but you keep getting tripped up on the implementation details, read the solution after 25 to 30 minutes. This is a little more aggressive than what people might say under different circumstances. But again, we don't have time right now. Now, one thing that you might think is, well, for really hard problems, 25 to 30 minutes might not be that much to practice, even if you're good. And to be truthful, if you've been behind on your LeetCode, you're not going to be able to solve problems this difficult after like a month of practicing. Good news is you probably don't need to. Here's why. So if we make a graph of company prestige on one axis, like how famous it is, how well they pay, that kind of thing, and how hard the interviews tend to be, you tend to get a correlation like this, right? So typically your big tech companies will be up here, pretty prestigious, but hard interviews. Hedge funds and quants are like way up there. Banks, Fortune 500 companies tend to be a bit lower, but towards the bottom, you tend to have more smaller companies and more non-tech companies. These companies tend to have easier interviews. And that works for us because, like we said, you guys should be applying to the smaller companies right now. You would be surprised at just how unexpectedly easy the technical interview questions for those could be sometimes. So I've heard companies like John Deere don't even have like LeetCode style interviews. It's crazy. And that's another thing that you might not know too. Not all technical interviews are LeetCode problems. Just to give you some examples of alternative types of technical interviews, you might have a skills challenge where, let's say, you're told in 20 minutes to build a basic React component that does something. You might have a take-home project where you have a few hours or even a few days to work on a more fleshed out feature. Or you could just have a discussion where you're talking about more conceptual questions. You might be asked about how does REST work? What is this design pattern used for? Idea is that these are alternatives to data structures and algorithms. And they're very useful because you can practice these skills just by working on the projects that you already need to be working on. It's not like LeetCode where it's an entirely different skill set on its own. That being said, these kinds of interview styles are less common at larger companies that have more standardized interview processes. So again, you want to shoot small. Now, if you want to look for companies that might be useful for this, there is a GitHub repo called Hiring Without Whiteboards. It's got a big list of companies that do their interview process without data structures and algorithms. That was questions. And if you're not that great at LeetCode, it might be a really good resource for you. And that's not the only list either. If you Google Hiring Without Whiteboards, you'll see several different lists on the results. Now, one more thing to remember is that if you have a poor technical round, a great behavioral can really save your behind, right? And we're not going to go into behavioral details that much more, just because we already have our resumes and interviewing workshop. The circumstances for that doesn't change that much when you're well on time. You know, have some good stories to tell about when you did leadership, when you had to make this kind of decision, so on and so forth. So feel free to check that out on our YouTube. We're going to go ahead and move to the last major section here. Or before we do that, let's recap for interview prep. Focus on your weaknesses, Don't stay stuck on tough problems. And if you're really struggling with leak code, see if you can find companies that don't do leak code style questions. Any questions on this section? All right, awesome. And then for our last kind of major section here, how do you prioritize your time during all this, right? It's a lot to do. First thing that you have to remember is that an internship beats a 4.0. Let me say it again, an internship beats a 4.0 for your resume. Now, a lot of things are going to be going on in the next couple of months. You'll have interviews, portfolio projects, class projects, finals, life, personal responsibilities, everything. And some of y'all, like that Jenga piece at the bottom, are just built different. But for some of us, something's got to give. You're going to have to give something up. And that's what prioritization is really all about. Asking yourself, what can you afford to lose the most? And for most of us CS majors, especially if our grades have been decent so far, that's going to be some grade points, right? Most companies don't really care if you have a 4.0, but they will care if you have internship experience more. So if you need to miss an assignment or turn an assignment or two in late, or even not study as much for your classes and exams because you're studying for your technical interviews instead, it might be a necessary sacrifice. You're preparing for the industry. Now, not everyone's situation is the same. If your GPA is near or below a 3.0, or you want to go to grad school, especially competitive grad school, then you might want to be careful because you might need good grades more than someone who's just planning to go right into being a developer after they get their bachelor's. So that just kind of leaves me on one last note, which is to say that not everyone's situation is going to be the same. I can't guarantee that this advice here is going to work for you. While I was in this same situation 2 years ago, the job market was way better 2 years ago. And anyone else who tells you it wasn't is lying. Hopefully, if this helps like at least one person get something, then it will like make my summer. So, you know, just try all these things out. Fingers crossed. I know a lot of you guys have been struggling and working super hard. I just want to say I've seen a lot of it. I'm so proud of like all of y'all just as a friend. I know it because I've been through it. And that's basically gonna be it for now. No matter what your fate is, at the end of our April for our last full workshop this semester, we'll be doing another double. That will help you take your next steps, no matter what your fate ends up being. So I'll be covering a workshop called the Internship Survival Guide, where we'll be talking about how to make the most out of your internships, perform well, and get that return offer. And Stephen will be doing one called So You Didn't Get an Internship, showing how to make the most of your summer to prepare for the next recruiting cycle. And that is it for the first workshop tonight. Give us a few minutes and we will get what we wish we knew as freshmen to set up.